proceeding with the PowerPoint accordingly, supposedly. All right? And I am going to proceed with this overwhelmingly significant, important fact about our subject this evening. It's a court case out of Missouri, 131 Missouri, 224. Make a note of that and look it up. It's also in Southwest. It's called Nolan et al. Versus Taylor et al. And it has to do with a suit over land and land ownership. And from that, we draw the following conclusions, and this needs to be made perfectly clear. A person, I'm citing the decision here, is identified by his name, but one Christian or baptismal name is recognized by the common law. In case the first Christian name is given, the second or initial letter of the second is immaterial in judicial proceedings. And there are citations for that. The judgment, therefore, against Jeff M. Thompson would be good against Jeff Thompson, or a judgment against Jeff Thompson would be good against Jeff M. Thompson, when in either case the judgment is questioned collaterally. The name of a person is that name by which he is known. If he has a known given name which he himself recognizes, that should be as good an identification in a judicial proceeding, whether it is the first or the second of those given him. If the second name is the one by which he is known and which he uses himself, the use of the initial letter of the first should be immaterial in these statutory proceedings to enforce the lien of taxes upon real estate where the property and not the owner is charged and the land is described in the proceedings. And what was all this? About military bounty land warrants that were located and entered in the name of M. Jeff Thompson. Now, of course, as some of you who know your Missouri law know that this case was still good in 1964 in the St. Louis suit involving putting the name of a coroner and his MD on the ballot. Those of you who don't know that can rest easy on this point and not get significantly disturbed. So, what do we have with this young lad? And what we have is, he tried to go to military school. He tried to enlist in the Navy of the Republic of Texas. And he was only 17 and they wouldn't take him. And so, well in advance, by decades, of the line that was borrowed by Horace Greeley, go west, young man. That is what he proceeded to do. And westward he took his sway, and westward, in this case, took him to Liberty, Missouri. I confess I have never quite been to Liberty, or at least not knowingly so. A town on the Missouri River. You recognize that in the early period there's no Kansas City. That's apparently now Liberty is a suburb of Kansas City. But there it was. Oh, good. Now if we get some way to move forward, we'll be in business here. Okay. Let's see what the next slide will present us with. Oh yes, the Pocahontas dedication. That is not M. Jeff Thompson. That is me, but I wore the hat again for sentimental reasons. And of course, that's an inherited hat. It passed down to me. It's probably older than I am, being an Ecuadorian Panamanian hat. But we'll take it at face value. Next. And there he is, one of the books. There are a couple of books on him, and if you try and find them, you better be prepared to pay big bucks. And one of them, which the ASU library supposedly had, was not on the shelf. So I'm operating at slightly less than full steam on this. So, moving on to the next slide. This is significant. and not generally known. What did M. Jeff Thompson share with Abraham Lincoln? A patent. Lincoln's the only president with a U.S. patent. And I won't say this with any positive certainty, but well, let's make a point about M. Jeff Thompson and make this very clear right now, even though it's a point we'll get to later. M. Jeff Thompson was never a Confederate general. He was a general of the Missouri State Guard. They would never recognize him or take him into the formal Confederate service. And I stand here as a proud Missourian with ancestors going back well before he arrived in Missouri, and pronouncing it correctly as I should be. That is a point of great pride. Moving on. What is it? Oh, because what did he engage in Liberty? Well, he started out as a clerk, then he started hauling goods, then he got into the Western trade, and then he moved to St. Joseph. I could probably dredge up the mayor of St. Joseph. There are lots of pictures of that early town on the river. And I remember one time when somebody was trying to pass off a picture of St. Joe as Van Buren, Arkansas. Because they looked almost identical. Courthouse and all, you know, up on the hill and the rest of that. Well, anyway, what he got into was engineering. And that involved the construction of railroads. He was involved in multiple railroads, and he started off at the very bottom. But he had all of the engineering skills, and accordingly came up with, and I need to read, in fact, that's, let me read this. The picture comes on, let's go back one so we get the object in question there. This is from the Museum of American History. This object, apparently the only invention Thompson ever patented, indicated that he was dissatisfied with existing tools for making detailed scale drawings that were necessary for all facets of operating a railroad, including surveying routes and maintaining engines and other machines. The ability to draw regular polygons with various numbers of sides at various ratios was also valuable in a number of engineering and military applications. Thompson envisioned selling this instrument to other machinists and engineers, but there is no evidence that it was ever successfully manufactured. The patent model may be the only example of his invention that still exists. And I explain, in case you don't know how this worked, you had to present a model of the patent office collected and kept all these models, and you can, there's a lot of research you can do and all of that if you get into those sorts of things. Well, anyway, here he is. He is the mayor of, he gets married, by the way. That's another important issue in that time. And the result of that was that all of this activity is so typical of the Midwest. It's so typical of modernization. I mean, this is not somebody creating a plantation system in Missouri. Where did we, in fact, have the plantations of Missouri? Actually, they're on the Mississippi River to the east, and what are they growing? Hemp for the rope market, not the marijuana market. Although the smell hung over the land, and the plant went wild, and I can tell you stories about Lawrence County, but we won't go there at this time. Anyway, that was one area of slave concentration, and not very much, but only some of it was in Swamp East, the Missouri Boot Heel. For those of you who don't know this, what was grown, the crop, or if you call it a crop, what do we, today in the agricultural, U.S. Department of Agriculture, chickens are a crop. That's the largest agricultural crop in Arkansas. Trust me on these points. Well, anyway, the man who was responsible for the creation of the boot heel ran cattle. ran them on the prairies. And we have Big Prairie, Grand Prairie, Little Prairie. If you look at any of the old surveys, you'll see that there are these 5, 20, 40, 50 acre pieces of prairies scattered all over the place. And that preceded slavery. In fact, the first settlers from Kentucky thought they'd grow tobacco, and what happened, the soil was so rich that the plant shot way up, but the leaves were a little tiny. It was good for corn. And at the Battle of Belmont, first battle of the Civil War in the upper Mississippi, mid-Mississippi, General Grant's life was saved because the sharpshooter couldn't see enough over the corn to pick him off. So it went. Well, anyway, with Thompson, the election of Abraham Lincoln produced a major crisis in his life, and he responded to that by I think one of the most interesting writings that I've run across in terms of the literature of the period there. And what he says is this: if the northern states that have passed laws nullifying the laws of Congress will not repeal them, if the majority of the people of the North insist upon waging a war of extermination upon us, if they continue to say we shall be hemmed in, cut off, and finally driven into the Gulf of Mexico, if their personal pecuniary interests will not stay their fanaticism and treason, then we must, for our own self-respect, for our own honor, for our fortunes, yea, for our very lives, drive them out of the Union. We're going to keep the Union. North's going to have to go away. I've never run across that in any of the other rhetoric or speeches of the time. But it's an interesting twist on these things. Well, it's worthwhile to say a word in this context. I don't want to belabor all this because we have to get you out in a good, timely way. What Missouri was really like. This was a state that had come into the Union in 1820. It had, of course, the Mississippi River. It had the site of one of 2 Revolutionary War battles fought west of the Mississippi, one at St. Louis and the other one at the post of Arkansas. And it had that nexus of culture that, like, what should I say, a giant fungus grew out of New Orleans and ascended up the river, infecting everything it touched. I'm thinking of Mark Twain and Hannibal all the way up there as a case in point. Well, at any rate, what happened in the 1840s? And this is the failed revolutions in Germany and their arrival in the United States, and St. Louis was one of the major areas. And they were, to a man and woman, anti-slavery. Secondly, who's in the Ozarks? Well, Cousin Mabel. Now I'm talking about Oregon County here, but this model will work for everything. I think she lived to be, 102 or something like that. Mabel Simons Woodside described it to me this way some 30 or 40 years ago. The uplanders and the lowlanders. The lowlanders had farms in the valleys. They cultivated agriculture for profit. They believed in schools, education, and civilization. Well, the negation of all of that was the uplanders. And some of the biggest fights, by the way, have to do with prohibition laws and other such sundry, which I won't get into at this time, but I certainly could tell the stories on them. And of course, in some counties, that element predominated, like Douglas, otherwise known as Booger County. Avy's the county seat of Douglas County, if you're not acquainted with all of this history. And in others, the lowlanders generally succeeded in controlling the government. Well, how many of those lowlanders were connected with slavery? And it's a relatively small number, but there always were African Americans in the Ozarks. And of course, most typically, as we find across Missouri and northern Arkansas, they were more likely to be, quote, mulatto than anything else. And of course, we also have mixed in with that and these are things we don't talk about until the 20th century, those with an Indian ancestry, which typically becomes classified as a Cherokee grandmother, although that's not a very accurate DNA description, as people often find out if they do their work on this. So where did Missouri stand at the coming of the Civil War? Well, the answer was you had a secessionist governor, Claiborne Jackson, but he couldn't move the legislature. Missouri called a convention. The convention wouldn't move. And then the Union Army moved on him. And that's what starts it all after. Well, of course, the sequence of events is, as you probably know, Lincoln is elected president. He's constitutionally elected. There's no question of that. He's sworn into office. Not until March. We kept that for a long time and changed it only in the 20th century. So, what is Lincoln going to do about the #1 sore spot, which is Fort Sumter? And the answer is, it's not what he does, it's what South Carolina does. They start the war. And I have argued, and a large number of historians agree with this, that that's when, quote, the South lost the war. Why? Because the ethnic South, which is all of Illinois up to and including Springfield, same with Indiana, a huge number of Revolutionary War veterans settled in Ohio with land grants from the Commonwealth of Virginia. And these people, who didn't have an interest in slavery but had an interest in culture, were not exactly overly enthusiastic to support the Confederate cause. And so South Carolina caused the Confederacy to lose the war. Now, of course, you can work all kinds of other formulas for doing this if you want to, but getting off on the wrong foot is one of the most critical ones. Well, what's the impact in Missouri? And the impact is that Jeff Thompson had been a militia leader and colonel in the West at St. Joe. They'd even had a threat. It turned out to be a bogus threat. You look at all the bogus stories. You want fake news. It is the stories that you get in the press in early 1861. There's a huge list of them in Arkansas, and this was one in Missouri. And so his neighbors got mad. They were all called out for service. Claiborne Jackson wouldn't pay them. They blamed Thompson, and Thompson washed his hands of St. Joe and was headed off to Virginia to fight for his home state. And I think it's important. Let me see if I can find this. He, at any time he needed to, would respond with poetry. And this is one example, if I can lay my hands on it right now. But I'm not singing. We'll do this one. Missouri, Missouri, awake from thy slumber. Hearest thou not the hammer that rivets thy chains? Can't the death shriek of fathers, the wail of thy mothers, the tears of thy daughters rouse thee again? Come, rise in thy might and drive the Huns from thy borders, and stand by the Southern sons in the fight. Pour forth all the men to help to the battle, for freedom, for glory, for justice, for right. Let the watchfires glow and thy bugles blast high o'er the mountains and valleys, o'er the prairies and lea. Then the loud shout shall ring o'er the prairies and streams. Hail, brothers, hail, Missouri is free. Anyway, he got stopped, pressed into service, and the rest of it we know is that Jeff Thompson, who never had any connections to southeast Missouri or northern Arkansas ever before, ends up becoming the Swamp Fox. Now, the key event going on here was what happened on May the 10th in St. Louis, when Captain, who will become General Nathaniel Lyon, who will end up dead at the Battle of Oak Hills, or Wilson Creek. This is one place where the apostrophe does not belong. Anyway, not to hammer a point home. Although I stand firm, ready to do this at any time, on any side of the question. Now, that said, Lyon attacked the Missouri Guard encampment. It resulted in the Camp Jackson massacre, and I'm not sure. Let me see if we've got, trying to think if I stuck in, there he is in a uniform. I don't know if I got there are pictures of that. No, we'll have to go on, we'll get to that too. Battle of Memphis is interesting. He was on the last train that was out. And I didn't mention this point, it's kind of fun. In the building of the railroad into St. Joe, he was not only the chief engineer for the latter part of the road, but he drove the first locomotive himself into the town. So, anyway, the Camp Jackson thing cannot be resolved. There's a conference held on this subject in June, and Lyon says he'll see them all dead. And trusting Lyon to act on that, the state government fled Jefferson City with Lyon in pursuit. And you have all kinds of people here that have to make decisions. Where do they stand? John Sappington Marmaduke, who figures in the narrative later on, reluctantly stayed with the State Guard and supported the governor, Claiborne Jackson. But his father didn't. Well, all this culminates in August of 1861 in that battle at Wilson Creek, Oak Hills, in which Lyon is killed. And here we've got a Missouri State Guard officer coordinating with Confederates. He meets Hardee, Gideon Pillow. One whole expedition, it was the Pillow fell through because Pillow had an embarrassment on part of his anatomy and couldn't get on a horse. But history turns on a lot of things like this. In October, a rump session of the legislature met in my hometown, Neosho, and the legislature voted Missouri out of the Union. My great-great-grandfather, a member of that legislature, was not present, but he had fought at Oak Hills. He appears in the records as Colonel Woodside. But what did Colonel Woodside do after October? He did not accept Missouri joining the Confederacy. And accordingly, he made his peace with the new Gamble administration in Jefferson City. One son stayed with the Confederacy, or joined the Confederacy, one of the Missouri Confederate regiments. The other served in a Union regiment. And you can play this over and over and over again in the families. Sterling Price, his son, is a Union officer. And Sterling, old Pat Price, former governor of Missouri, who did not want the war, but had it by Lyon forced upon him. Well, anyway, what happens? The Union Army collects and begins to move down the Mississippi River. And that's the Battle of Belmont, of which I spoke. And you can go to the other side of the river and see the Confederate fortifications still high up on the bluff. They had a great monster cannon there, which unfortunately blew up the first time they tried to fire it. And we have this battle for control of southeastern Missouri. And this is where Thompson gets his reputation. And his actions are both brilliant and timely. And what he can do is cut communications. And he confuses the Union Army by appearing in different places at different times. It's almost like he carried a printing press, or rather he tweeted all the time where he was. And the Union Army had no idea that some 7,000 men were tying down 40 or 50,000. burning railroad bridges, all kind, threatening St. Louis. I mean, really. But those are the stories that were told. My favorite one that I will share with you is how to finance all of this in the absence of regular Confederate support. And he raided the town of Clarkston, Missouri. That's the county seat of Mississippi County, Missouri, for those of you who don't know this. And it's almost literally right across the river from Cairo, which is not Cairo, not really Cairo, but Cairo. Bird's Point, it being the point on the Missouri side, if you get into the geographic details. Well, anyway, what he did, he carried a cannon with him, placed it in front of the bank at Charleston. Then he rode to the home of the bank cashier and called out the cashier and handed him a note, a copy of which exists, and a quote, "President Directors of the branch of the Union Bank. You have until 8 a.m. to determine whether I shall take possession of the funds in jurisdiction or whether your cashier shall remove the same, books and all, to Bloomfield, under my charge, subject to further orders from the commanding officers of the Missouri State Guard." And you know, with that cannon sitting there, they gave him the money. And off they went to Bloomfield. That's Stoddard County. 16 times in the war, Stoddard County changed hands. Wow. And you realize what this means. If I were going to try and do a historical study of every one of his campaigns, I would have to have the bluest congregation of maps and arrows and stuff imaginable just to show how all this works. But what happens? Well, he continues all of this. And it's important, too, to note that after October 28th, when Missouri joined the Confederacy, they added a star for Missouri on the Confederate flag. After that, Confederate officers could give orders directly to State Guard officers, such as Thompson was. So, at the same time all this is going on, something else rather horrible is happening. It's the guerrilla warfare. And the guerrilla warfare was one of the things that he utterly insisted he would not participate in. Now, what's complicating that? They can't get uniforms for his men. It's not clear. You can't tell Yankees and Confederates. And of course, if you study any of this war, you'll know that the Confederates got a lot of their uniforms off of Yankees and turned them inside out and wore them in the absence of other clothes. So there's at least one important battle at Fredericktown in which his small force engages and is essentially defeated by a much larger force of Union soldiers, but he carries off all the lead. Why was this area, just heading up north of us between here and St. Louis, so critical and important for the armies? Lead. Why was Granby in southwest Missouri important? Lead. What do you think you make bullets out of? Now, I can tell you, but you don't want to hear, there are ladies present, on how the Confederacy collected some of the chemical resources necessary for making ammunition. But you needed lead for bullets. And with that, what we get is a situation that slowly but surely the Union forces are being pushed back. There's a good deal of incompetence on the Confederate side that we don't need to go into, Forts Donaldson and Henry and those stories. And of course, the Battle of Memphis, and now we can do that, which is a naval battle, fought right there, general vicinity of the New Bridge. which is the one that DeSoto crossed on, you know. So. And as I say, Thompson got the last train out of there. So what we get is an individual who is a charismatic leader. First place, he paid careful attention to his clothes and his horse and all the elements of command to make him distinctive. And that was an important part of his persona. And a quotation is worth here. General Jeff Thompson, being in command of the Confederate forces in southeast Missouri, moved his command by way of Marble Hill through Bollinger and St. Francis counties to Colonel Jack Smith's residence just north of Big River Bells. When, near Libertyville, a number of citizens met with us with loads of good things to eat. They gave us a bountiful spread and some of the prettiest girls to wait on us. My Jeff was in his glory, naturally vain, a great admirer of ladies, a good talker. So after dinner, he gave them a speech, all complimenting the dinner and the pretty girls. He told them that his ragtag Missourians could whip their weight in wildcats. He expressed an opinion that I have often thought of. He said that undrilled soldiers were the best fighters. The reason being, they didn't know when they were licked, but the drilled soldiers did, as did their commanders. Now, then what happens? What brings this all to Pocahontas, which, by the way, he visited several times? And that is, it is his capture. And the story on that is worthy of note. And this is recognize that this event that we are so concerned about happened 75 years ago on August the 22nd. Just past the eclipse, right? Yeah. I mean, what else can I say? Okay. He and two companions were working on their military maps, hotel, and suddenly they heard horses approaching, and one of the men, Captain Reuben K., yelled, "By God, here's the feds!" Thompson gasped in dismay, but quickly collected his wits and ordered, "Kay, burn those maps." He immediately began to tear the maps in small pieces, which Kay then burned in the kitchen stove before the Union officers came in. One of their captors was Captain Henry C. Gentry of Marion County, Missouri, the son of the president of the Hannibal and St. Joseph Railroad. After the initial shock, Thompson accepted his capture with dignity and good humor, which remained his demeanor throughout his imprisonment. And that is a very long and complicated story, as he was transferred from prison to prison to prison until he was finally released. Prison did not break him down, and he did everything he could to sustain the morale of those around him. So now we have to consider some things that will have to be said. Here's one of the poems. "Come, comrades, open wide your eyes and listen while I sing. I promise that you'll shed no tears about the news I bring. For all seems bright and hopeful too in our fair southern land. For all that we now have to do is keep our gizzards full of sand. For we of all the noblest hosts that strike for southern rights need patience more and suffer most, being kept away from the fights. Where glory, honor, and hate would sweeten every blow, while all we do is damn the fate that will not let us go." Here he is trapped in prison and writing poetry about it. The other piece of poetry, The Final War Years, My dear wife awaits my coming. My children lisp her name. Kind friends would bid me welcome to hear dear home again. My father's grave is on the hill, my boys lie in the vale. I love each rock and murmuring rill, each mountain, wood, and dale. I'll suffer hardships, toil and pain, for a good time's sure to come. I'll battle on that I may gain my freedom and my home. I will return, though foes may stand, disputing every rod. My own dear home, my native land, I'll win you, by God. But he didn't. And the South went down to defeat. And of course, that left Thompson stranded. As I say, he never became a Confederate general. And this is what he wrote after the war. I am sitting here tonight, friends, the last night of the year. I'm thinking of the gloomy past and all the friends so dear who have fallen in the horrid war which recently scourged our land, and I mourn for them, the noble dead of our chivalrous Southern band. But how did he turn that into action? And the answer is, he devoted himself to rebuilding the South economically. One of the greatest moments, in many ways, is when his troops at last surrendered at Witzburg and Jacksonport. And he gave them this speech. And the speech went like this. He told the men to go home, obey the law, cooperate with authorities. He railed against those in his command whose behavior had been less than honorable. In part of the speech he said, I now come to surrender you and hope you will make better citizens than you made soldiers. I know there's some gentlemen here. I know there's some damn sneaky, cowardly dogs who would never have done anything on nary side. And so, there was a good deal of booing from the ranks. But what had happened? The soldiers he had started out with had been the volunteers, the cream, the elite, the select. The ones he'd ended up with were the deserters, those dragged in by conscription, the river rats. Nobody pays much attention to river rats except those that know about river rats. But that is a major part. And piney wood folks generally, you get into Mississippi and the county of Jones, on opposition within the South to the Civil War. People just who they were there for a reason, and the reason was to be left alone, whether it was North or South. And of course, the real war, as has been overwhelmingly demonstrated in all some of the books, is the guerrilla war. And this was something that Thompson and other Freeman, General Freeman, or Colonel Freeman, they shot these guerrillas when they could catch them, especially if they'd been caught a second time. And there are times when both the Union and the Confederate officers signed an informal truce so they could in fact hunt down some of these bands. So Thompson is a gentleman. He keeps that. And his latter life is imperiled by the fact that he had contracted the tuberculosis that eventually would kill him. But what he worked for was reunification, not the lost cause. And there's the best quotation is this one. A reporter later, after his death, General Thompson is a fascinating man, apparently about 50 years of age, tall and slender as a boy of 18, with clean-shaven chin, closely trimmed mustache, small keen eyes, large positive mouth, broad forehead, massive lower jaw, together with a nervous, earnest manner while engaged in conversation. He impressed me as one remarkable man. He is a fair type of the Southerner, physically, the Northerner, mentally, and the Westerner, by his manner and broad progressive ideas. He is a Virginian by birth and a cosmopolite in experience, ideals, and manners. And that brings me to a good and important point. Why we should honor him. Why his presence here is part of our collective national memory. Because there are those who don't seem to appreciate the cause, who don't appreciate not the results of the war, but the individuals involved with it. I would, for instance, point out Robert E. Lee, whose statue is the full source of contradiction and removal issues, which I'm not personally have studied. But what was Lee's response to the war? Turn to education. And he made a point of denouncing those who wanted to keep alive the hatreds of war. If we are to go through history and remove all evidence of anybody who doesn't measure up to some hypothetical standard of the present, we have no history at all. And I stand before you as a historian with ancestors on the Union. My mother's grandfather, great-great-grandfather, came over to fight from England. He was a nonconformist, i.e. Methodist minister. He was 60 years old. Served 3 years in the Wisconsin Infantry Unit and signed on as the chaplain of Colonel LaRue Harrison's 1st Volunteer Union Cavalry. He said, "Boys, I may die in the fight, but I will be glad if I can shed my last drop of blood to wipe out the evils of slavery and demon rum." And he wasn't killed. Lived, went back to his wife in England. To have the ancestry, to know the history, to see where it is going and where it should go and where it could go and where it didn't go, all of that is what the historical understanding is all about. I want to refer to an article. Oh, no, I'm not quite done. Friedrich Nietzsche once identified 3 approaches to history: monumental, antiquarian, and critical. Nearly all historical monuments, of course, are meant to be flattering to their subjects. It's probably asking too much to expect them to be critical in Nietzsche's sense. But one can expect basic accuracy and honesty. And that is what public history, this is Eric Foner, famous historian, Reconstruction historian, that is what it is all about. And I was glad to dedicate that monument. I was glad to climb up to the top of the Confederate cemetery and give a great, powerful, ripping oration on Patrick Cleburne, another Southerner with a vision that transcended his military career. And so with that, I will throw things open for questions, comments. Yes?
In my reading of history around here, I have come across a local fear of lop-eared Germans from St. Louis.
Oh, yes. Yeah, the lop-eared Dutch.
Yeah.
Oh, we have a couple more slides. Could we push the...
Well, does that have to do with their haircut, or where did that name come from?
I don't know, but it's universal in the literature.
Wow.
Thompson, I didn't quote this one, but it's a good line. He thinks they could win the war if they could just capture Missouri and destroy the breweries, because then the Germans wouldn't last a day or two and they'd all be dead. And let me tell you another little piece of historical trivia, because I'm into this with World War I. Into the United States entry of World War I, the United Brewers Association were still holding their meetings in German. Schlitz, Busch, Griesedick, going over all those German names. And yeah, those were the people who made the beer. So anyway, yeah, there's another. Is that the last one there? Oh, there's Bloomfield. Anybody been to Bloomfield? Okay. And that's where I ran out of pictures. Another question. Well, now, yes.
So where did he finally, when the war was over, did he go back to St. Joe, or where did he die?
No, he didn't go back to St. Joe. In fact, I think he was traveling for his health, or his lack of health, when he died. And I'm not sure where. Ideally, I should have done that. Look up a grave and see how that's marked. I'll remember to do that if I do this presentation again. But you can learn a lot from cemeteries, and you can learn a lot from how things are portrayed in cemetery art or monuments on state capitol grounds, or the last. One of the books I have with me, Confederate Women of Arkansas, the original publication of that was designed to raise money for one of those monuments that's on the state capitol grounds. And the dear ladies, and I've not explored this sufficiently, got into a huge fight because over what they considered to be the appropriate kind of monument, what it should look like. And art matters. Statues matter.
Are you familiar in the biography on Dr. Bayshore here in Pocahontas? They give an account of the capture of Jeff Thompson, and there seemed to be some confusion, at least according to that biography, as to whom had whom prisoner. Did you come across that in your...
Not offhand. That kind of rings some bells from way back when we did the dedication, but yeah. And of course, the one thing you always get historically is confusion.
Of course, I mean, I've got that book right here, Dr. Dougan, and of course this is not a scholarly piece at all. It's a biography based on notes of Dr. B. Shore. But he says that it was 4 in the afternoon, Dr. B. Shore says, it was 4 in the afternoon, he was asleep, and he heard the horses out here on the square, and he looked out the window, and he was confused. And they came and got him and brought him down to where Jeff Thompson was. And he said, I thought they were ours. I thought they were our soldiers. And Jeff Thompson says, they're not ours, but you might say we are theirs.
Pogo, come to the rescue.
Yeah, exactly.
That's a good line.
Well, did his capture coincide with the Union taking over the St. Charles Hotel as headquarters of sorts?
I think so, and I would have to. They remained here for some long time. All this gets complicated as the war goes on in terms of how much ground the Union wanted physically to occupy, when every time you were garrisoning a place, you were taking troops away from battlefields and campaigns. And there was a lot of discussion of that, plans to evacuate Batesville at various times, and other things relating to that. So, but they obviously were here for some time.
Did you ever see the TV program of the Swamp Fox? Leslie Nielsen played him. This was probably in the 60s.
No.
But I loved it. Man, I wouldn't miss it. I mean, it was great.
I wonder if it's on YouTube.
I don't know. But this has been a long time ago.
Huh.
And It's before I moved to Oklahoma City. But anyway, he, like you said, he slipped in and out. That's how he got away from the army of England, was because he was so slick. You know, he wore this hat with a big feather on it, and he was just, he'd go wherever he wanted to, but you'd think they were going to capture him, and first thing you knew, he was gone.
Getting through the Mingo Swamp was one of the great accomplishments of Thompson.
I actually brought this book to Nancy there because her family cemetery is the Spikes Cemetery out toward Dalton. And two of Dr. B. Shore's first two wives are buried in her cemetery. So I brought this book to give her. And I just happened to be on your night.
Okay. Well, coincidences make an awful lot of history. I mean, what if they decided to leave early from the hotel?
Yeah.
And other things are the little tidbits that are interesting. During the war, his family, his wife and children, were able to get passes from the Union Army, come down to Little Rock and visit and go back. There things like that that you would not expect to happen that did, and that's probably worthy of some comment. But there's an entire article, a former friend of mine and two of his colleagues, devoted simply to how he used rhetorical strategies in combining with military activities to achieve what was at one point a major fame. This is not an obscure individual in terms of the 19th century or the course of the Civil War. He's become, I guess, more obscure simply because so little attention for so long was paid to the war in the Trans-Mississippi. But this is one step forward in bringing Jeff Thompson, back into the prominence that he deserves.
You know, you made a comment that he was not a Confederate general, and that he would have to take commands from I wonder what rank. I mean, what could a captain give him?
That's a good question, and I really don't know the answer to that. I would assume not. I would assume it would have to be someone of equal rank. This didn't prove, see, he kept wanting to, I want to become a Confederate general. He went to Jefferson City. Well, you can't get, I mean, he went to Richmond to try and get that done, and Jefferson Davis never did it. In one sense, it didn't really matter much because most of his time was spent in an area where there were no Union generals anyway. But it was, I think, for him a question of honor, that his work deserved recognition, and that's the honor that should be bestowed upon him. I should mention, in case any of you are really deep into this stuff, that there is an entire book, Guide to Missouri Confederate Union Units, 1861-1865, and there, I don't know, 15 or 20 references probably to Thompson, of groups that were with his, one that never quite got organized and then became part of this and part of that. And of course, a major feature of the war in the West was simply the inability to keep units together, and either from casualty loss, desertion, or simply running out of food supplies and disappearing off into the dust somewhere.
Doctor, could I change the subject just a second?
Sure.
I've known Dr. Dougan a long time. I haven't read this book in 20 years, but everybody in Pocahontas should be familiar with this book, and you'll love it. This is your wife who did this.
Yeah, we edited it.
Is she a PhD?
Huh?
Is she a PhD?
No.
Okay,
she got
she's
a
a
master's
researcher.
though. Yeah.
Yeah, okay. But I've given this book to people for Christmas and stuff like that. I've bumped my head on your fool tree on the yard to go down there to get them. But Rocky and Jake, if you haven't read this book, you really should. It's a collection of short stories by really a very famous and popular short story writer.
Yeah. One of the major ones, late 19th century.
Yeah. And she spent her summers in
Clover Bend.
Yeah, Clover Bend. I couldn't think of the word, which is not far, of course, from here. And this was before the rice fields and before the swamps were drained and so forth. And in the spring, they would walk in water up to their ankles or knees just to get to the next house. It's something that we've lost, and we sure hope not in our history. And interestingly enough, the first, half the book is written in dialect?
Oh, yes.
Tell them about that.
Well, she would go to the store. This is Alice French. She came down from Davenport, Iowa, and she and another friend had this plantation house that had a much earlier history to it, before the Civil War. And she had taken up writing, so she'd go to the store and hide behind the counter somewhere, and then scribble down how people were talking. So there's what you get is plain Southern speech, and there are African Americans that appear in the stories on occasion, and there's one in here that is right interesting, and I didn't really understand. It took an English professor 20 years later to figure it out, and the title of it is Whitson Hart Regulator. Came out in 1887. Regulator, that's the same as lynch law. That's the old 18th century term, regulation. And Whitson is a man of the gospel, and he's convinced that there's this sin going on, and he's haunting them day and night, giving them all kinds of trouble, and it turns out he's wrong. This story came out right after the Vatican Council pronounced the infallibility of the Pope. And so she just took the Pope and turned him into a minister and did a number. And I didn't see this, but it certainly rings true. And there are wonderful stories of modernization. The woman that wants the house painted, the dog's kicked out of the house, and they've got a little steam engine, and they're all good and interesting stories. And I've got more copies. Should anyone be interested in the book, but it's just an important part of the literary history of the period. And of course, this is a period that is not well known. We know so much about the Civil War. We know some about Reconstruction, and then we really don't key into a lot of stuff until we get to the Great Depression and the sharecroppers and all of that. There are gaps in understudied decades, and that's certainly one of them.
Well, if there's no other questions, thank you, Dr. Dougan. Sorry to disappoint you. I was at the Wilson Creek National Battlefield this weekend, and their signs are all wrong. So perhaps you should go and talk with the administration there at the park on that. As many of you know, Ransom Bettis was one of the earliest settlers in our area and considered the founder of what is now Pocahontas. Bettis was born in Moore County, North Carolina on November 14th, 1787. Just 4 years after the War for American Independence and 2 months after the Constitution was adopted by the Constitutional Convention in Philadelphia. Bettis, like so many early Americans, migrated west to Wayne County, Missouri, and in 1827 he moved to Arkansas, or what would become Arkansas, and established a ferry and trading post near present-day Overlook Park on Black River and created a settlement here known as Bettis Bluff. To give you a better perspective of the era, this occurred during the presidential administration of John Quincy Adams, who was our 6th president. The successful Bettis became active in territorial and state politics. Here in the early 1830s, he even hosted the wedding of Archibald, I can't ever say that word, Archibald Yell. Archibald Yell, to Maria Ficklin, and Yell in 1840 was elected as the 2nd governor of Arkansas. Bettis's daughter Cinderella married Thomas Drew, who was elected Arkansas 3rd governor in 1844. In 1835, when Randolph County was created, both Bettis Bluff and the township of Columbia, 8 miles to the north, competed for the seat. As we all know, Bettis Bluff won the vote, perhaps due to the free barbecue and liquor provided by Bettis and Drew during the election here in Bettis Bluff. This spring, the Executive Committee of Five Rivers Historic Preservation Incorporated created an award in the name of Ransom Bettis to recognize those individuals who actively research and promote the history of Randolph County. Over the past several years and on many occasions, Dr. Dougan has obliged Five Rivers when asked to speak at various engagements and commemorations. His expertise in Arkansas history, particularly the Civil War and Reconstruction, has imparted a knowledge and transparency to hundreds in our community so that we may have a better understanding of the historic events that unfolded in our very historic county. On behalf of Five Rivers Historic Preservation and as a former student, it is very much my pleasure to present the first Ransom Bettis Award to Dr. Michael Dougan.
I am indeed honored, and you rattle off all those names. Of course, that's Ficklin Ferry, and actually what that gets into is the Married Women's Property Act, which Archibald Yell vetoed, but which Drew signed and put everything in Cinderella's name, which he couldn't spell. And it's a reminder how much history is local, and how much you gain from knowing the genealogy, the connections, how it all fits together. And the really fun part, of course, is when it doesn't fit at all. So thank you on behalf of me and Arkansas State University.
There you go.
Thank you.
As usual, as expected.